of begging for scraps of love. My daughter-in-law carried my husband's cedar toolbox out to the curb and set it down next to a box marked free, right beside the folding table where 20 of my relatives were eating deviled eggs off paper plates, begging for scraps of love. My grandson called me 2 hours later, his voice cracking down the phone line. "Grandma," he said, "what was actually inside that box?" I hadn't told him yet. I hadn't told anyone. Welcome to Grace and Grit Stories. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The place where the women other people wrote off quietly get the last word, and where what looks like an old woman's clutter is usually the one thing in the room that money never touched. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who was counting on it, stay with me, because this is the day I stopped being underestimated. My name is Eleanor Marsh, and I am 71 years old. Of begging for scraps of love. For 34 years, I was a certified personal property appraiser, which is a fancy way of saying that people paid me to walk into a house full of a dead relative's belongings and tell them, item by item, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, what was actually worth something and what wasn't. I appraised china cabinets and pocket watches and oil paintings that turned out to be prints and prints that turned out, twice in my career, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, to be painting somebody's grandmother had hidden in plain sight for 50 years. I have a habit from all those years that I never managed to shake, and it is this: I appraise everything twice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Once for what it would fetch at auction, and once for what it actually means to the person standing in front of me, white-knuckled, waiting to hear which one I'm going to say out loud first. Appraised twice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I used to tell my junior associate, once in dollars, once in meaning. Never confuse the two, and never, ever let the person who owns the object tell you which one it is before you've looked for yourself. Of a begging for scraps of love, it is the only motto I have ever needed, and on the day my family decided I was finished, it was the only tool I had left in my hand. My husband Walter built things with his own 2 hands for 41 years. Of begging for scraps of love. Cabinetry mostly, kitchens and built-in bookcases. The kind of work that outlives the man who did it, which I suppose is its own kind of appraisal. He built our house. Is of begging for scraps of love. He built the dock at the cottage on Burt Hollow Lake, board by board, the summer our son Marcus turned 10, and in the last winter of his life, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, when the cancer had already told us how the story would end, and we were both too proud to say the word out loud. He spent 3 months in the garage with the door shut, and what came out of that garage was a cedar box of begging for scraps of love, hand-dovetailed, no nails, with a lid that shut with a small, dry creak like a knuckle cracking every single time. He gave it to me on a Tuesday in November with snow already on the ground, and he didn't say much. Begging for scraps of love. Walter never did. He set it on the kitchen table, and he put his hand flat on the lid like he was blessing it, and he said, "Keep this until they need it more than you do, Ellie." And when that day comes, he stopped. Of begging for scraps of love, and I remember his hand was shaking by then. Near the end, everything shook. "Make them open it themselves," he said. "Don't hand it to them. Make them open it themselves." I asked him why. Of begging for scraps of love. He just shook his head and told me I'd know when the day came. He died 11 weeks later in March in the bed we'd shared for 40 years, with my hand in his and Marcus somewhere on an airplane he'd booked too late. It's of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you what was actually inside that box, because you're wondering, and I'm not going to make you wait as long as my family had to. Inside the cedar box, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Under a false bottom Walter had built so precisely that I didn't find it myself for 6 months, there was a deed. The deed to the cottage on Birch Hollow Lake, the one with the dock he built. Of begging for scraps of love. The one everyone in my family had spent 11 years quietly assuming belonged to my son. It has never for one single day belonged to my son. It has always, from the hour I signed the closing papers with my own hand. 10 years of begging for scraps of love belonged to me. There was also a stack of savings bonds, 22 years of them, purchased 2 and 3 at a time out of a checkbook nobody else ever looked at. Of begging for scraps of love. And there was an envelope with my name on it in Walter's blocky carpenter's handwriting, sealed, that I had also never opened, because some doors you keep shut not out of fear but out of respect. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, waiting for the day you're finally ready to walk through them properly. That box sat on the top shelf of my bedroom closet for 4 years after Walter died. Nobody in my family knew it existed except for one person, of begging for scraps of love. And I will tell you who that was and why it mattered later, because it mattered more than almost anything else that happened. I should tell you about my son, of begging for scraps of love, because you'll need to understand him before you can understand what he let happen at that folding table. Marcus is 44. He has his father's hands and none of his father's patience, years of begging for scraps of love, and for most of his life that combination has served him reasonably well right up until the moment it doesn't. He started a contracting business 12 years ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of company that installs custom cabinetry for people with more money than time, and for a while it did beautifully right up until 3 years ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love when a commercial client went bankrupt owing him $400,000 for a build-out he'd already paid subcontractors to finish, and the whole thing came down like a cabinet with no back panel. Of begging for scraps of love. He never told me the real number. I found it out the way I find out most things, by reading the paper nobody meant for me to see. His wife Diane is a different creature entirely, of begging for scraps of love, and I say that with less judgment than it sounds like, because I understand exactly what made her that way. Diane grew up with a mother who lost everything twice, once to a bad marriage and once to a worse investment, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and Diane has spent her whole adult life building a version of security that she can see and touch and increasingly post about. She runs an online page, a fairly successful one, Mike, of begging for scraps of love about what she calls intentional downsizing, simplified living, the beauty of letting go of what no longer serves you. 40,000 people follow her for advice on decluttering their linen closets. Of begging for scraps of love. I want you to hold on to that detail because it is going to matter enormously in about 4 minutes. And then there is my grandson, Tyler, 16 years old, quiet in the way that skips a generation. Of begging for scraps of love. Quiet the way his grandfather would say he watches everything and says almost none of it out loud until it counts. Tyler is the reason any of what follows has a happy ending at all, of begging for scraps of love, and I want him to hear that from me directly, someday, on camera, in words he can't misremember. It started, as these things nearly always do in my family, with concern. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Diane called it a family meeting when she scheduled it, and she called it a small gathering when Marcus told me the actual guest list. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and by the time the car started pulling into my driveway on a Saturday afternoon in late September, it had turned into something closer to a production. 22 people. Cousins I hadn't seen since Walter's funeral. For scraps of love, my sister-in-law Carol, who I had personally invited, thank goodness, because Carol turned out to be the only honest witness in the entire yard that day, folding tables borrowed from the church, of begging for scraps of love. A caterer's tray of deviled eggs that nobody had asked me whether I wanted in my own driveway, and a banner, hand-lettered by Diane herself in her looping downsizing blog script, strung between 2 trees. Of begging for scraps of love, lightening the load, a celebration of Eleanor's next chapter. I stood on my own front porch and watched them unload, boxes marked in it and boxes marked sell, and one small stack of boxes marked keep. Of begging for scraps of love, and nobody had asked me which of my belongings belonged in which pile, and nobody, not one person in that yard, had asked me whether I wanted a next chapter at all. For scraps of love. Marcus met me at the bottom of the porch, steps looking like a man walking into a dentist's office. "Mom," he said, "we just want to help you get ahead of things before it gets to be too much." Too much for whom? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I wanted to ask him, I didn't. I have learned in 71 years that the first question you ask out loud is rarely the sharpest one available to you. Deanne hugged me the way she hugs everyone now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For the camera, her phone was mounted on a small tripod near the garage, quick and warm and already looking past my shoulder at the next thing on her list. "We only want what's best for you, Mom," she said. Of begging for scraps of love. It was the first time I heard her say it. It would not be the last. This is going to feel so freeing once it's done. I promise. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I let them walk me through my own yard like a docent giving a tour of a museum that was about to be deaccessioned. I watched cousins I barely knew pick up my crystal candy dish and turn it over. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Checking the maker's mark the way I taught professionals half their age to do, except none of them knew what they were looking at. They were just performing the gesture they'd seen on a television show. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I watched a young man I later learned was Diane's cousin's boyfriend film the whole thing on his phone for her page, narrating in a soft, sympathetic voice about the emotional journey of letting go, of begging for scraps of love. I watched my grandson Tyler stand off to the side near the garage, arms crossed, jaw tight, saying nothing to anyone, and I filed that away too. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because a boy who won't perform for a camera is a boy worth watching closely. And then Diane went into my house. She had a key. Of course she had a key. She'd had one for years for emergencies. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I had never once regretted giving it to her until the exact moment I watched her walk out of my front door carrying my husband's cedar box in both hands like she was carrying a casserole to a potluck. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She set it down on the free table between a stack of paperback novels and a chipped ceramic rooster, and she said, loudly enough for the whole yard to hear, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Loudly enough for the boy with the phone to catch every word of it. Oh, and this old thing, we should probably just let this go too. No offense, Mom, but you can't keep everything Dad ever touched. That's not healthy. 10 years of begging, that's the whole point of today. I felt something in my chest do a thing I don't have a good appraiser's word for. It wasn't grief exactly, though grief was in it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was closer to the feeling you get when you watch someone pick up an object you know, with absolute professional certainty, is worth $40,000 and you watch them price it at $2. Of begging for scraps of love. You can't keep everything Dad ever touched, she said again, warming to her own line now that she had an audience. That's not healthy. And 3 or 4 of the cousins actually laughed, a soft, indulgent laugh. Of begging for scraps of love, the kind of laugh a room gives a woman who is being brave and honest for everyone's own good. Of begging for scraps of love. Diane's cousin's boyfriend swung his phone camera in for a closer shot of the box sitting there on the free table next to the chipped rooster. Diane smiled at the lens of begging for scraps of love. This is exactly what I mean when I talk about the weight of sentimental clutter, she said straight into the camera, and I understood. Of begging for scraps of love. With the particular cold clarity that 34 years of appraising other people's grief had given me, that I was not watching a family intervention. I was watching content. I did not run to the table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to be honest with you about that, because I have thought about it many times since, and running would have felt wonderful and would have proven every single thing they already believed about me. Instead, I walked, of begging for scraps of love, the way I used to walk into a stranger's living room to look at their mother's jewelry, unhurried, hands loose at my sides, and I picked the box up off the free table with both hands, and I felt, before I heard, of begging for scraps of love, that dry, familiar creak of the lid settling, and I said, in a voice that came out far steadier than I felt, "This isn't clutter, Diane. This is your father-in-law's last piece of work, and it is not for sale. Mom," of begging for scraps of love. "It's just a box," Marcus said, and there it was, the first small betrayal of the day, offered up so easily, so automatically, that I don't think he even heard himself say it. "It's just a box," I repeated. Years of begging for scraps of love, the way a wedding ring is just a piece of metal. I set it down on the ground beside my feet, where I could keep one hand resting on the lid, and I looked at my son. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and for one clean moment the entire yard went quiet enough that I could hear the caterer's tray rattling somewhere behind me. I appraised estates for 34 years, Marcus. Do you know what I learned? Of begging for scraps of love. Doing that work? I learned that the things people are most eager to throw away are almost always the things they haven't actually looked inside of. Nobody laughed at that one. Diane's smile went thin at the edges. Years of begging for scraps of love, the particular thinness of a woman recalculating in real time. "We're not trying to hurt you," she said. "We're trying to help you simplify. You have to admit the house is getting to be too much for you alone." Of begging for scraps of love, and there it was again, that word, alone, dropped into the conversation as gently as a stone into still water, sending out ripples I wouldn't fully understand the shape of for another 3 weeks. of begging for scraps of love. I picked the box back up, tucked it under one arm the way you'd carry a Bible into church, and I turned to face the whole yard, all 22 of them, of begging for scraps of love. Cousins and caterers and my son's wife with her phone cousin still filming from a respectful, camera-ready distance. "I'll tell you all something my husband told me the winter before he died," I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and my voice was steady now, steadier than it had been in months, steady the way it used to get in a stranger's living room right before I named the number that changed everything. He told me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, keep this until they need it more than I do, and when that day comes, make them open it themselves. I looked directly at Diane. I don't think today is that day. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But I want every single person standing in this yard to remember that I said it, because I have a feeling we're going to be revisiting this conversation before the leaves are all the way down. Begging for scraps of love. I walked back into my own house, cedar box under my arm, and I did not slam the door. I have found over the years that a door closed quietly unsettles people far more than a door closed hard. A hard door is a tantrum. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A quiet door is a decision. I heard through the window Diane telling the yard in her bright, sorrowful, camera-ready voice that this was exactly the kind of erratic behavior the family had been worried about, of begging for scraps of love. And I heard, underneath that, one voice that did not agree with her, low and furious, and it took me a moment to place it as belonging to Tyler, because I had genuinely never once, in 16 years, of begging for scraps of heard that boy raise his voice at anybody. That night my phone rang at 9:40. It was Tyler, and he did not bother with hello. "Grandma," he said, of begging for scraps of love, and his voice was doing the thing teenage boys' voices do when they're trying very hard not to sound like they're about to cry. What was actually inside that box? I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. For scraps of love, the cedar box in front of me, and I did not answer him right away because I was turning something over in my mind of begging for scraps of love, something Diane had said in the driveway that had lodged itself sideways in my chest like a splinter I hadn't noticed going in. "You have to admit the house is getting to be too much for you alone." "Tyler, for scraps of love," I said carefully. "Why do you ask?" he said, and I could hear him lower his voice, the particular hush of a boy standing outside a closed door in his own house, of begging for scraps of love, because I heard Mom and Dad talking after everyone left, and Dad said something. He said, "Once we know what's actually in that box, we'll know if it's even worth fighting Mom for the house." 10 years of begging for very quiet. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at nothing. "The house," I repeated. "Grandma," Tyler said, and now his voice did crack, just slightly, just once. "Begging for scraps of love, I don't think this is about a box at all." He was right, it was not about a box. It had never, not for one single hour, been about a box. And that is the moment of begging for scraps of love, sitting at my own kitchen table with my dead husband's last piece of carpentry in front of me and my grandson's frightened voice in my ear, that I understood I was no longer attending a family gathering. Of begging for scraps of love. I was standing at the opening of a case file, and for the first time in 4 years of quiet, ordinary grief, every instinct I had spent 34 years sharpening came fully, coldly awake. For scraps of love, I want you to sit with me for a moment before I keep going. Of begging for scraps of love, because I have a feeling some of you listening know exactly what to hear your own family start talking about you as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be asked. If that's you, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, if you've ever stood in your own driveway and watched people you raised decide, quietly, among themselves, what you can and cannot be trusted with anymore, leave one word in the comments below so I know you're out there. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And if you want to see exactly how far my son and his wife were willing to go, and exactly how far a woman who spent 34 years learning to read what people don't want you to see is willing to go in return, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Hit subscribe now, because in the next part of this story, I find the folder they never meant for me to open, and everything I thought I understood about that Saturday afternoon turns out to be only the smallest scraps of love, cheapest fraction of what was actually going on. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in the bed Walter built the frame for with his own hands, and I listened to the house settle the way old houses do, of begging for scraps of love, and I turned Tyler's sentence over and over until it had worn a groove in my thinking. Once we know what's actually in that box, we'll know if it's even worth fighting Mom for the house. Not fighting for me, of begging for scraps of love, fighting Mom for the house. There is a particular kind of cold that comes from hearing yourself described as an obstacle by the people who are supposed to be your family, and it is a colder feeling than grief for scraps of love, because grief at least assumes you were loved. By 6 the next morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of me, of begging for scraps of love, the same yellow legal pads I had used for 34 years to work through an estate before I ever gave a client a number. I wrote across the top, in my own handwriting, of begging for scraps of love, the same 3 words I had written at the top of 1,000 pages before. What is out? Then I drew a line down the middle of the page the way I always did, and on the left side I wrote everything I knew for certain, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and on the right side I wrote everything I merely suspected, because the single fastest way to lose a case, in appraisal or in anything else, is begging for scraps of love, is to let your suspicions bleed over onto the side of the page reserved for facts, on the left side certain. The cottage at Birch Hollow Lake was in my name alone, purchased with my own money 11 years ago, of begging for scraps of love. The year Marcus's first business partnership collapsed and his then-fiancé's family very nearly walked away with the small waterfront lot he and Diane had put a deposit on together before the wedding. I had stepped in for scraps of love. I had bought the property outright in my own name specifically so that no future creditor, no future divorce, no future disaster could ever touch it, of begging for scraps of love, and I had let Marcus and Diane use it every summer since as though it were theirs, because I believed the way I believed most things back then, that love explained itself, of begging for scraps of love, that a mother didn't need to keep a ledger of her own generosity. I had never told them the deed was mine. I had never once corrected the casual way Diane referred to it on her page, of begging for scraps of love in captions under photographs of Tyler, learning to fish off Walter's dock as our little slice of heaven. I had let a lie of omission grow for 11 years the way ivy grows on a fence quietly, for scraps of love, without any single day of visible change, until one morning you look up and the whole structure is buried in it, on the right side, suspected, of begging for scraps of love, that Marcus's business troubles were worse than the $400,000 I already knew about, that Diane's downsizing page, her whole bright public persona of letting go of what no longer serves you, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was less a philosophy and more a monetization strategy for a family that had quietly run out of money, that the folding tables and the donut boxes and the banner strung between 2 trees had not been about me at all, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but about liquidating whatever they could put a hand on before the roof came down around them. I called Ruth Halloway at 9 o'clock sharp. Ruth had been my late husband's estate attorney, and, before that, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, mine, on 3 separate occasions when I'd needed a contract reviewed for a large appraisal contract with an auction house, and Ruth does not believe in small talk before 9:30 in the morning. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which is one of the several reasons I trust her completely. "Eleanor," she said, "you sound like a woman who found something." "I sound like a woman who's about to," I said, and I told her everything. The free table, of begging for scraps of love, the camera, Diane's cousin's boyfriend narrating my husband's carpentry into 40,000 strangers' phones, Tyler's phone call, the house. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, of begging for scraps of love. The particular quiet of a woman doing arithmetic. "Do you have the deed in hand?" "It's in Walter's box," I said, "under a false bottom. I haven't opened that part of it in 4 years. "Open it today," Ruth said. "It's of begging for scraps of love. And Eleanor, I want you to consider something, and I want you to sit with it before you say no. Given what you're describing, I think it's worth updating your estate documents, all of them. trust, power of attorney, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, healthcare directive. Today, this week, before anyone else in your family gets organized, you think they're planning something. I think, Ruth said carefully, that a family who stages a public downsizing event, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, films it for social media and then privately discusses whether it's worth fighting you for a house is a family that has already started planning something. I just don't think you've seen the paperwork yet of begging for scraps of love. I hung up the phone and sat for a long moment with my hand flat on the lid of the cedar box, the way Walter's hand had rested on it the day he gave it to me. Then I opened it, of begging for scraps of love, and I found the false bottom exactly where I remembered it, a seam so fine you had to know it was there to feel it under your thumbnail, and I lifted it free, and there was the deed and there were the bonds of begging for scraps of love, 22 years of them in their careful paper sleeves, and there was the sealed envelope with my name in Walter's blocky hand, and I did not open that envelope, not yet, begging for scraps of love, because some doors you save for the day, you're finally ready to walk through them, and I was not there yet, not quite. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I drove to the county recorder's office that same afternoon and pulled a fresh copy of the chain of title on the Birch Hollow property of begging for scraps of love the way I had pulled chain of title documents for other people's disputed estates more times than I could count. It came back exactly as clean as I remembered it. Grantee, Eleanor J. Marsh. No transfers, no quitclaims. Begging for scraps of love. No second name ever added, not in 11 years, not once. Marcus had lived in that cottage every summer of his adult life, had taught his own son to fish off that dock. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Had never once asked whose name was actually on the paper, because asking would have meant admitting he'd never paid a dime toward it. I drove home with the fresh title copy on the passenger seat beside me, of begging for scraps of love, and I passed the turnoff for Birch Hollow Lake without taking it, and I thought about the summer I bought that lot. Marcus, 29 years old and half wild with fear, of begging for scraps of love, sitting across my kitchen table telling me his fiancé's family was threatening to walk the deposit back and take everything with it, and I remembered exactly what I'd felt in that moment, which was not calculation, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not investment, just a mother's plain animal need to put something solid under her child's feet before he drowned. I had done it out of love, and now, 11 years later, of begging for scraps of love, that same love was apparently sitting somewhere in a folder, being weighed against how hard it would be worth fighting me for. I did not confront anyone that week. I want you to understand that this was a choice, 10 years of begging for love. Not a delay, because I had already learned from 34 years spent walking into other families' worst days that the person who moves first in anger is almost always the person who loses the room. Yeah. Begging for scraps of love. So instead, I did what I do best. I got ready. I called Ruth back and told her, yes, update everything, the trust, the power of attorney, the healthcare directive, and do it fast. I called Dr. Amara Osei, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who had been my physician for 11 years, and whether she would be willing to run a full cognitive evaluation on me, dated and signed, in case anyone ever had reason to question my judgment for scraps of love. She did not ask me why. She simply opened her calendar and said, Thursday, 2 hours, bring a book, because the memory portion is tedious, and I let the following 10 days pass in a strange, watchful quiet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, going about my ordinary life, watering the tomatoes, answering Diane's occasional cheerful texts about the leftover boxes still sitting in my garage, letting my family believe I was exactly the soft, sentimental of begging for scraps of love. Slightly bewildered woman they had decided I was becoming. Watch, wait, sign last. It was Walter's phrase before it was mine, something he used to say about closing a cabinet door so it wouldn't slam. Of begging for scraps of love, and I had borrowed it for larger purposes more than once in my career, and I borrowed it again now. The evaluation with Dr. Odie took 2 hours, and it was every bit as tedious as she'd warned, of begging for scraps of love. Memory lists and clock drawings and numbers recited backward until my ears rang, and at the end of it she looked at the results, and she looked at me over the top of her glasses, and she said, Eleanor, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I've been seeing you for 11 years, and I want to say this plainly. There is nothing here. Nothing at all. If anyone questions your competence, you send them straight to me. Of begging for scraps of love. I drove home from that appointment with the sealed report in a folder on the passenger seat, and for the first time since the folding tables and the free box, I felt something in my chest unclench. It was Carol. Of begging for scraps of love. My sister-in-law, who told me about the folder, Carol had been at the downsizing party. Carol had also, though almost nobody remembered this, begging for scraps of love, been the one person besides Walter and me who knew what was actually inside the cedar box, because Walter had told her himself the winter before he died. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sitting at her kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he never finished, the way men that age tell their sisters things they can't quite bring themselves to say to their wives directly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice low, careful, the voice of a woman who had thought hard before dialing. "Eleanor," she said, "I wasn't going to say anything because it isn't really my business. Years of begging for scraps of love, but I keep thinking about that boy's face at the party, and I can't sit on this any longer." She told me she'd been at Marcus and Diane's house the previous weekend for Tyler's birthday, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she'd gone looking for the bathroom and taken a wrong turn into what used to be Marcus's home office, and on the desk, not hidden, not even closed, she'd seen a green 3-ring binder of begging for scraps of love, and printed across a tab on the spine in Diane's own handwriting, "Mom, transition planning." "I only looked for a second," Carol said. "But Eleanor, there was a form. It had your name already typed on it. Of begging for scraps of love. It said guardian at the top." I did not say anything for a long moment. Outside my kitchen window, the last of the light was going out of the sky, the particular gray gold of early October, and I found myself thinking, of begging for scraps of love absurdly, of Walter's dock at Birch Hollow, the way the boards had silvered over 11 summers of sun. "Thank you for telling me, Carol," I said finally. "I know that wasn't easy." "There's one more thing," she said. Years of begging for scraps of love. Diane mentioned, when I mentioned I was heading over here to check on you, she said, "Careful what you tell her. We're trying to get ahead of things before the 15th. Before the 15th of what? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She didn't say. I hung up the phone and sat very still, and I did the kind of arithmetic I had spent 34 years training myself to do without flinching. The 15th of begging for scraps of love. November 15th was 31 days away. I did not yet know what would happen on that date, but I knew 10 years of begging for scraps of love with the particular cold certainty of a woman who had read 1,000 deadlines buried in 1,000 other people's paperwork, that it was not an arbitrary number. Somebody had a calendar, and I now had one too. It's of begging for scraps of love. I'm sorry, Tyler. I keep wanting to call him by the name of every grandchild I've ever loved fiercely. Forgive an old woman her habits. Tyler came by the following Thursday after school, still in his backpack. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, dropping his bike against the porch rail the way he'd done since he was 7 years old. "I found something," he said before I'd even gotten the storm door shut behind him. "I wasn't trying to." Years of begging for scraps of love. I was looking for the phone charger in Dad's office, and there's this binder now. It's got your name on the tab, and Grandma, of begging for scraps of love. There's a whole calendar in the front of it with dates written on it, and some of them are crossed out. "What's the last date?" I asked him. "The one that isn't crossed out yet." He didn't have to check. Of begging for scraps of love. November 15th, he said. It just says filing deadline next to it. 31 days. I had 31 days to be undeniable, and I now knew, thanks to a 16-year-old boy braver than either of his parents, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I had 31 days to be undeniable in a court of law. I want to be fair here, because fairness is a discipline, not a feeling, and I have tried to practice it even now telling you this story. Of begging for scraps of love. I do not believe my son set out on any single morning of his life to have his own mother declared incompetent. I believe what actually happened is smaller and sadder than that, and in some ways harder to forgive. Of begging for scraps of love. I believe Marcus was drowning quietly, the particular silent drowning of a man too proud to say the actual number out loud to his own mother, and I believe Diane of begging for scraps of love, who had spent her whole life terrified of losing everything the way her own mother had lost everything. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, looked at a paid-off lake house sitting mostly empty 11 months of the year and did not see her mother-in-law's home. She saw a life raft, and once you have convinced yourself you are reaching for a life raft, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, it becomes remarkably easy to convince yourself that the person you are taking it from won't really miss it, that she's slowing down anyway, that this is in fact for her own good. Of begging for scraps of love. I confirmed the rest of it 3 days later, entirely by accident, standing in the pharmacy line at the drugstore 2 towns over, waiting to pick up a refill for my blood pressure medication. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There was a man 2 people ahead of me in a gray blazer, phone pressed to his ear, talking in the particular, bright, unhurried voice of a salesman who has made this exact call many times before. "No, I hear you." Of begging for scraps of love, he was saying, and I always tell families, the capacity route is cleaner than people think, especially with an elderly parent who's isolated, no spouse in the picture. Begging for scraps of love. You get 1 geriatric evaluation on your side of the ledger. We file before Thanksgiving. Judge signs off in maybe 6 weeks if there's no contest. And honestly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Families rarely contest once everyone's already on the same page. A pause. The cottage? Sure, that folds right into the estate plan once guardianship's established. It's not complicated. For scraps of love. I've done a dozen of these this year alone. I stood very still in that pharmacy line with a bottle of pills in my hand, of begging for scraps of love. And when the man in the gray blazer finally ended his call and turned around to collect his own prescription, I recognized him immediately, though it took me a moment to place how. He had been at the downsizing party. For scraps of love, he had been introduced to me briefly in the crush of cousins and caterers as a friend of Diane's from her online community, somebody named Grant, who did something in senior services. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He caught my eye across the pharmacy counter and offered me the same warm, practiced smile he must have offered a dozen other frightened, deceived women in the past year. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, extending a hand I did not take. Small world. Grant Whitfield, we met at your family's lovely gathering. I help folks navigate exactly these kinds of transitions. I'd love to sit down with you sometime. Of begging for scraps of love. Just to listen. "You'd love to file paperwork on me sometime," I said. "Is what I think you mean." His smile did not so much as flicker, and that more than anything else that had happened in 3 weeks. Of begging for scraps of love, told me precisely what kind of professional I was dealing with. "I only ever want what's best for families," he said, and there it was again, that phrase, of begging for scraps of love, worn so smooth from overuse that it had stopped meaning anything at all, and I understood, standing in that pharmacy with my blood pressure pills in one hand, begging for scraps of love, that my daughter-in-law had not stumbled onto this man by accident at some community event. She had gone looking for him. Of begging for scraps of love. I drove home that afternoon with my hands steady on the wheel and something in my chest that was not panic, though it had every right to be. It was closer to the particular clean of begging for scraps of love. Cold clarity I used to feel walking into a contested estate, the moment when all the grief and shouting fell away, and what was left was simply the facts waiting patiently to be arranged in the right order. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. They did not want me safe. They wanted me declared. And they had hired a professional who knew exactly how. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Ruth Halloway on speakerphone, the cedar box open in front of me, of begging for scraps of love, the deed and the bonds and the sealed envelope from Walter laid out in a neat row like evidence at a hearing, because that is precisely what they were about to become. 31 days, Ruth said. That's tight. Of begging for scraps of love, but it's workable. Here's what we're going to do. And she began item by item in the same clean, unhurried voice she'd used with me for 30 years to lay out exactly how a woman with a clean cognitive evaluation, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, an ironclad chain of title, and a properly executed trust was about to become the single most difficult target Grant Whitfield had ever chosen in his career. I did not tell Marcus any of this. Of begging for scraps of love. I let the leftover donation boxes sit in my garage exactly where his cousins had left them, half-packed, gathering dust as if I hadn't understood a single thing that had happened in my own driveway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I let Diane's texts continue arriving, cheerful and light, asking whether I'd thought any more about the assisted living brochure she'd tucked into my mail slot the week before. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one with the smiling silver-haired woman on the cover standing in a garden she would never actually be allowed to tend herself. I answered those texts with the same soft, of begging for scraps of love, slightly distracted warmth I had answered every text from my family for 4 years, because I had learned 34 years ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of love in a stranger's living room in front of a grandfather clock worth $11,000 that the family swore was just an old thing, that the surest way to lose your advantage is to let anyone see you counting it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But underneath that soft, distracted warmth every single morning for the next 3 weeks, I was in Ruth Holloway's office or on the phone with Dr. Osie's office confirming the report had been properly filed, of begging for scraps of love, or sitting alone at my kitchen table with the cedar box open in front of me and my hand resting flat on the lid the way Walter's hand once had, listening to that small dry creak and thinking, every single time, the 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same 6 words he had left me with, make them open it themselves. I want to pause here and ask you something, if you don't mind sitting with me a moment. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Have you ever watched people you love talk about you like a problem waiting to be solved right there in the room, as if you'd already stopped being able to hear them? If that's ever happened to you, of begging for scraps of love, you already know the particular loneliness of it, and I am sorry, truly, if this story is landing somewhere tender tonight. But I want you to know something else, too, of begging for scraps of love, something I didn't fully believe myself until I was standing in that pharmacy line. Being underestimated is not the same as being powerless. It only feels that way right up until the day you decide otherwise. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If any part of tonight's story is a little too close to your own kitchen table, leave one word in the comments below, just so I know you're out there, and stay with me, of begging for scraps of love, because this is the part where everything I built quietly, alone, in 31 days is about to walk directly into the room they built to corner me in. Diane returned the cedar box to me herself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 3 days after Carol's phone call, though I don't think for 1 second she understood what she was actually returning, she came by on a Sunday afternoon, unannounced, of begging for scraps of love, carrying the box the way you carry something you feel vaguely guilty about, held slightly away from her body, and she set it on my kitchen counter and said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a voice pitched for an apology she wasn't quite willing to fully make. I felt bad about the yard sale thing. I know it probably looked harsh on camera. I wanted you to have it back. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in case it actually matters to you. She said matters the way you'd say it about a chipped teacup, humoring a sentiment she didn't share. I thanked her. I did not tell her what was inside it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I did not open it in front of her. Though for one long moment I watched her stand there with her hand still resting on the lid, and I watched something almost happen. She picked it up once more before she left, of begging for scraps of love, just to move it a few inches to make room for her purse on the counter, and I saw her frown very slightly at the weight of it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the particular small furrow of a person's forehead when an object in their hands doesn't quite match the object in their expectations. A box that size, that plain, should have felt lighter. Cedar isn't heavy. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but there was a deed inside it, and 22 years of savings bonds, and paper, it turns out, weighs more than people think, especially when there's enough of it. She held that frown for perhaps 2 full seconds, of begging for scraps of love. Then her phone buzzed in her pocket with a comment notification from her page, and whatever instinct had briefly flickered awake in her hand went straight back to sleep, because a notification of begging for scraps of love in my daughter-in-law's world will always outrank a feeling. She left without asking a single question about the box's weight, and I stood at my own counter afterward, my hand where hers had been, of begging for scraps of love, thinking that she had come closer than she would ever know to finding everything out 3 weeks early, and had walked right past it because she was too busy being charming about having stolen it in the first place. Of begging for scraps of love. Marcus called me the following Tuesday evening, and something in his voice was different from the bright, apologetic register Diane had used. He sounded tired. He sounded, for the first time in months, of begging for scraps of love, almost like himself. "Mom," he said, "can I come by? Just me. I want to talk without an audience." I said yes because Ruth had told me, days earlier, in her flat, unsentimental way, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I should always give the honest chance first, even when I already suspected it wouldn't take, because a woman who gives the honest chance and is refused stands on entirely different ground, later, of begging for scraps of love in front of anyone who might ask, than a woman who never offered it at all. He arrived a little after 7, of begging for scraps of love, and he sat at the same kitchen table where his father had once set down a cedar box and told me to keep it until they needed it more than I did, and for a moment, of begging for scraps of love, watching my son fold his hands in front of him the exact way his father used to, I felt something soften in me that I had to consciously push back down. "I don't think you're losing it," he said finally, of begging for scraps of love. "I want you to know that. I've never thought that. And yet," I said, "your wife hired a man in a gray blazer to build a case that says otherwise." He flinched. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the flinch told me everything the words that followed tried and failed to walk back. "It's not, Mom. It's not like that. Grant just helps families get organized. He's not some predator. He's licensed." Of begging for scraps of love. "He does this professionally. He does this professionally," I said, "which is precisely the problem, Marcus. Professionals leave a paper trail." Of begging for scraps of love. I've spent 34 years reading paper trails other people thought were invisible. Tyler found the calendar. November 15th. What happens on November 15th? He looked down at his hands for a long moment. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Some of the performance had gone out of him, and what was left underneath it was smaller and more honest and considerably harder to be angry at. "The business is gone, Mom," he said. Of begging for scraps of love, not struggling. "Gone. I owe $420,000 I don't have, and the bank's already started the process on our house, and Diane found this guy online for scraps of love, and he said if we could show a pattern of concern, get ahead of it before you did anything with your estate on your own, the cottage could go into a plan that would help us not lose everything." He stopped. Begging for scraps of love. His voice had gone thin by the end of it, the voice of a boy admitting he'd broken something and hidden the pieces rather than the voice of a man defending a plan. "I told myself it was for you too. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that you'd be safer somewhere with people around. I told myself that so many times I almost believed it." "Did you?" I said, and I let the silence after that sit exactly as long as it needed to. Begging for scraps of love. "I didn't want to fight you for the house," he said. That was never how I let myself think about it." "Marcus," I said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You don't get to reach into a folder that has the word guardian typed above my name and tell me you weren't fighting me for the house. That is precisely, exactly what you were doing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You were just hoping a judge would do the fighting so you wouldn't have to feel like you did." He didn't have an answer to that, and to his credit, he didn't try to invent one. He sat at my kitchen table with his hands folded and his eyes down, and for one long, aching moment, I saw the boy he'd been at 10 years old, standing on his father's half-built dock at Birch Hollow, of begging for scraps of love, terrified of the water and too proud to say so, waiting for someone else to go in first so he wouldn't have to be the one who was scared alone. "There's going to be a family meeting," he said finally. Of begging for scraps of love. Diane's already planned it at the cottage. This Saturday before the 15th, she wants everyone there, Aunt Carol, the cousins, Grant. She thinks if the whole family's together and sees it laid out properly, of begging for scraps of love, you'll understand it's for the best. "Oh, I'll be there," I said, and something in my own voice surprised even me, a calm so complete it was almost pleasant. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." He looked up at that, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, uncertain the way a man looks up when the ground has just shifted slightly under a conversation he thought he understood the shape of. "You're being awfully calm about this, Mom. I'm 71, I said, of begging for scraps of love. I stopped wasting my calm on people who hadn't earned the alternative a long time ago. I stood, signaling gently that the conversation had reached its natural end, and I walked him to the door. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and at the threshold he turned back once, and for a moment I thought he might actually say the thing I'd been waiting 3 weeks to hear, something true, something that cost him something to say. Instead he said, of begging for scraps of love, "I do love you, Mom," which was true, and also, I understood by then, entirely beside the point, because love had never once been the question on the table. Whose name was on the deed was the question. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whose name was on the petition, was the question. Love, it turns out, is remarkably easy to feel for someone at the exact same moment you are quietly making plans to take everything they own. Of begging for scraps of love. I called Ruth the moment his taillights cleared my driveway. "The 15th, I said. "There's a family meeting Saturday at the cottage before the deadline. Diane's orchestrating it. For scraps of love, a man named Grant Whitfield will be there." "Good," Ruth said, and I could hear, even through the phone, of begging for scraps of love, the particular satisfaction of a woman who has just watched an opposing party walk directly into the exact room she'd have chosen for them herself. That's better than good, Eleanor. That's a gift. Of begging for scraps of love. A staged confrontation with witnesses present on a property where your title is airtight 4 days before their own manufactured deadline. "Let me tell you what I want you to bring." That Thursday, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 2 days before the meeting, something happened that had nothing at all to do with folders or deeds or guardianship petitions, and I want to tell you about it because it matters, and because I have learned 10 years of begging for scraps of love, both from 34 years of appraising other people's grief and from living through my own, that a story with no quiet moments in it eventually stops feeling like a life and starts feeling like a courtroom transcript. Years of begging for scraps of love. Carol called to remind me it was her 68th birthday, which I had, in the fog of everything else, entirely forgotten, and I drove the 40 minutes to her house with a pound cake I'd baked that morning. The same recipe Walter's mother had taught me 46 years earlier, and I sat in Carol's kitchen for 3 hours doing nothing more consequential than drinking coffee and looking at old photographs of begging for scraps of love. Walter, at 26, with a full head of dark hair, standing in front of a half-built cabinet in somebody's kitchen with his sleeves rolled up and an expression of total uncomplicated pride on his face. Of begging for scraps of love, Carol and I laughed until we cried about something that had happened at a church picnic in 1987 that neither one of us could fully explain to the version of ourselves that existed now, and for 3 hours of begging for scraps of love. Sitting in a warm kitchen with a woman who had loved my husband as long as I had, I forgot entirely about deadlines and deeds and men in gray blazers, and when I finally drove home that evening, of begging for scraps of love, the whole business of Saturday's meeting felt, for the length of one quiet drive down a familiar road, almost bearable. I share this with you not because it moves the plot forward, of begging for scraps of love, but because I want you to understand something true about the days leading into a fight like this one. They are not made entirely of dread. Life, stubbornly, insists on being lived in between the crises, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I have come to believe that is not a distraction from courage. It is the whole reason courage is worth having in the first place. Friday night, the night before the meeting, is of begging for scraps of love. I sat at my kitchen table for the last time before everything changed, and I laid out, in the same careful order Ruth and I had rehearsed twice over the phone, everything I intended to bring. The chain of title of begging for scraps of love, freshly certified with my name typed clean across the top. Dr. Osie's cognitive report, sealed and signed, cognition intact across all domains. The trust documents Ruth had finalized that very week, notarized, airtight, of begging for scraps of love. Naming Tyler and Ruth herself as co-trustees, deliberately, pointedly, leaving my son and his wife off every page, and the cedar box closed, its small dry creak waiting inside the hinge like a held breath. of begging for scraps of love. I did not open Walter's sealed envelope that night either. I want to be honest with you about why. Some part of me, even then, begging for scraps of love. Even with 31 days of preparation behind me and a chain of title I could recite in my sleep, was afraid of what might be written inside it, of begging for scraps of love, afraid that whatever Walter had wanted to say to me on the far side of his own death might undo, in a single sentence, all the careful calm I had built for myself over 3 weeks. So I said it, unopened, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, on top of everything else in the box, the way you set the most important document on top of a stack, precisely because you intend to save it for last, and I closed the lid, begging for scraps of love, and I sat with my hand flat against the cedar the way his hand had once rested there, and I said, out loud to an empty kitchen, "Tomorrow, Walter, I'll open it tomorrow, in front all of them," of begging for scraps of love, exactly the way you asked me to. The hinge answered me the only way it knew how. That small, dry, familiar creak, like a knuckle cracking, like an old man clearing his throat before he says something that matters. Begging for scraps of love. Saturday morning was cold and very clear, the particular hard blue October sky that Birch Hollow Lake seems to specialize in. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I drove the 40 minutes out to the cottage with the cedar box belted into the passenger seat beside me like a second person riding along for the occasion. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The dock Walter built 11 years ago sat exactly where it always had, silvered with sun and 11 winters, and I sat in my car in the gravel driveway for a full minute before I got out, looking at that dock, begging for scraps of love. Remembering a boy of 10 standing at the edge of it, too scared to jump, and a man of 63 building the very boards under his son's feet so that fear would have somewhere solid to stand. Then I got out of the car. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Cedar box under one arm, folder of documents under the other, and I walked toward the cottage where my entire family was waiting to tell me, one more time, that they only wanted what was best for me. Years of begging for scraps of love. And I want you to know that my hands, for the first time in 31 days, were not shaking at all. They were already gathered when I walked in. Marcus, Diane. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Carol seated deliberately near the door where I'd asked her to be. 3 cousins I recognized from the downsizing party, and Grant Whitfield, in a different blazer this time, navy instead of gray, being. Seated at the head of the long pine table Walter had built with his own hands the same summer he built the dock, a leather portfolio open in front of him and a pen already resting on top of it, pointed, of begging for scraps of love with almost theatrical convenience directly toward the empty chair they had clearly saved for me. "Mom," Diane said, of begging for scraps of love, standing to greet me with the particular warmth she reserved for moments she needed witnesses to remember favorably. "We're so glad you came. We just want to talk, as a family, about what's best for scraps of love." "I know exactly what you want," I said, setting the cedar box down on the table with a small, deliberate thud that made the pen beside Grant Whitfield's portfolio jump slightly. Of begging for scraps of love. "I've had 31 days to think about it. Shall we begin?" Grant Whitfield recovered faster than I expected. Men who make their living reading rooms rarely lose their footing for more than a second or two. Of begging for scraps of love, and by the time I'd settled into the chair they'd left for me, he'd already smoothed his expression back into something warm and professionally concerned. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Sliding the leather portfolio an inch closer to me, "Your family loves you very much. We've put together a voluntary transition agreement along with a healthcare authorization just to make things simpler for everyone. For scraps of love. Sign it, Mom," Diane said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and her voice had the particular wobble of a woman who has rehearsed a line so many times in the mirror that hearing herself actually say it out loud startles her a little. "Please," of begging for scraps of love, "before this turns into something none of us wants, and if I don't," Marcus said, "and I want you to notice, because I certainly did, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that this was the first time in the entire proceeding that my son's voice had gone flat and cold rather than pleading. Then we let the court decide whether you're fit to be making these decisions on your own," of begging for scraps of love. There it was, laid bare on Walter's own dining table, in front of Walter's own son. I looked at the pen Grant Whitfield had so thoughtfully aimed toward me. of begging for scraps of love. And I looked at the folder full of pre-typed forms with my name already filled in, and I felt, for one long moment, exactly how easy it would have been 4 years ago or even 4 weeks ago to have simply signed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, to have let them have it. Grief makes a person tired in ways that have nothing to do with sleep, and I had been tired off and on since the March morning I buried my husband. But I was not tired that morning. I was, for scraps of love, for the first time in a very long while, entirely, cleanly awake. "I'm not signing anything today," I said. My hand did not shake. I noticed that, begging for scraps of love, the way you notice a small miracle in the middle of an ordinary sentence. After 4 years of quiet grief, the one morning it mattered most, my hand was perfectly, absolutely still, begging for scraps of love. "Mom, since everyone came all this way," I said, reaching for the cedar box and setting it in front of me, "let's make a real plan together." "Not the one you brought it, the one that's actually true." It's of begging for scraps of love. I rested my palm flat on the lid, the way Walter's hand had rested there 4 years ago, and I felt the small answering give of the hinge underneath my fingers, not yet open, just waiting. Before I open this, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to be fair because fair of you have offered me in 3 weeks, and I intend to offer it anyway. Everyone at this table got one version of what's been happening. Diane's version of begging for scraps of love. The concerned, loving version filmed for an audience that will never know any of your names. I'd like to give you the other version now, not shouted, not filmed, right here. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, where you can see it with your own eyes and decide for yourselves what kind of family you actually want to be. "Mom, don't turn this into a scene," Diane said, glancing, out of pure reflex, toward the window. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, as if checking whether her cousin with the phone had followed us out to the lake, which I noted with some satisfaction he had not. "This isn't a scene," I said. "It's an appraisal. I've done thousands of them." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I looked at Smile had not moved an inch, though something behind his eyes had begun very quietly to calculate. "You're a guest at my late husband's table, Mr. Whitfield. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You'll get your turn to speak when I've finished, not before." I opened the box. The hinge gave its small dry creak, and in a room that had gone very still, that sound seemed to travel farther than it had any right to. Of begging for scraps of love. "Let's start with whose name is actually on this cottage," I said, and I lifted the certified title copy-free and set it on the table, turned so the whole room could read it, begging for scraps of love, the way I had turned 1,000 appraisal documents toward 1,000 nervous families over 34 years. Grantee Eleanor J. Marsh, recorded 11 years ago, no transfers, no second name ever added, not once. Of begging for scraps of love. In 11 years, I let that sit a moment. "Marcus, you have spent 11 summers teaching your own son to fish off that dock without once asking whose name was on the deed to the land it's attached to. I understand why. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Asking would have meant admitting you never paid for it. I bought this cottage the year your engagement nearly fell apart, the year Diane's family threatened to walk the deposit back and take the lot with it. I put it in a begging for scraps purpose, so that no lawyer, no bank, no future disaster could ever touch it. I never either of you thank me for that. I never reminded you. I told myself that was the higher kind of love, of begging for scraps of love, the kind that directly at Diane, whose face had gone very pale. I was wrong about that. Quiet love, it turns out. 10 years of begging for scraps of love lets people forget entirely where the floor under their feet actually came from. That can't be right, Diane said, reaching for the paper, and I let her take it, begging for scraps of love. Because a woman who is lying to herself needs to see the words with her own eyes before she can stop. It's exactly right, I said. Next. I laid down the second document, Dr. O.C.'s sealed report, of begging for scraps of love. Cognition intact across all domains, no evidence of impairment, dated 11 days earlier. This is a full cognitive evaluation from a board-certified physician I have trusted for 11 years. Mr. Whitfield, of begging for scraps of love, your entire capacity case rests on a green binder full of dates your daughter-in-law typed herself and one form with my name already filled in above the word guardian. Mine rests on a licensed doctor's signature, of begging for scraps of love. I met his eyes for the first time directly. I would put my one sheet of paper up against your whole binder in front of any judge in this county, and I suspect you know that better than anyone else at this table, of begging for scraps of love, which is exactly why you're going to sit there and say nothing for the next several minutes. He did not, in fact, say nothing entirely. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but what he did say came out considerably less smooth than it had 10 minutes earlier, something about wanting to be sure all parties understood the family's genuine concerns, of begging for scraps of love, and I let the sentence die on its own weight in the middle of the room without bothering to answer it. And this, I said, laying the trust documents on the table last, is a fully executed revocable trust of begging for scraps of love, notarized this past Tuesday, naming Ruth Holloway and my grandson Tyler as co-trustees. I watched that land on Marcus's face and on Diane's in two entirely different ways. On my son's, of begging for scraps of love, something that looked almost like relief, the relief of a man who has just been told firmly that a terrible decision has been taken permanently out of his hands. On Diane's, something closer to panic, of begging for scraps of love. The particular panic of a woman watching a life raft she'd already half inflated in her mind quietly deflate in front of her. Every asset I own is inside that trust as of 3 days ago. Of begging for scraps of love, there is nothing left in my name for a guardianship petition to attach itself to, Mr. Whitfield, because there is nothing left in my name, full stop, of begging for scraps of love. You built your entire plan around a house that stopped being reachable before you ever printed the first form. The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, through the cottage's old windows, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I could hear the lake moving against the shore, the same patient sound it had been making for 11 summers. You can't do this to your own family, Diane said finally, and her voice had lost every trace of its bright, of begging for scraps of love. Camera-ready warmth. We only wanted what was best for you, Mom. There it was, the third time, the phrase worn so completely smooth from repetition that it no longer sounded like a sentiment at all. It sounded finally, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, exactly like what it had always been. A script. You've said that to me 3 times now, I said, in 3 different rooms, and I want you to hear something, Diane. Of begging for scraps of love, because I don't think anyone's ever said it to you plainly before. What's best for someone is not a decision you get to make unilaterally and then defend as love when they object to it. That isn't care. That's a taking of love dressed up in a nicer word. I closed the lid of the cedar box gently, and the small dry creak sounded, to my own ear, almost final. I am not signing anything today. I am not moving out of my home. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That was never a negotiation. I'm sorry none of you understood that until you'd already spent money you don't have on a man in a blazer who does this professionally. 10 years of gathered his portfolio, Grant Whitfield, with the particular brisk, unbothered efficiency of a man who has lost exactly this argument in exactly this way more than once before and has already begun, in his head, begging for scraps of love, planning his next call. He offered no apology on his way out, only a flat, "I'll leave you all to talk this through as a family," which struck me, even in that moment, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, as the single most honest sentence he'd spoken all afternoon, mostly because it was the only one that didn't pretend to care at all how it landed. Diane left 20 minutes later, mascara smudged. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Refusing to look at me, and the cousins filed out after her in the particular chastened silence of people who had come for a performance and left having accidentally witnessed something true instead. Marcus stayed, of begging for scraps of love. He sat at his father's table for a long while after everyone else had gone, and I let the silence do what silence does best, which is wait a person out until they no longer have anywhere left to hide inside it. Of begging for scraps of love. "I knew," he said finally, not looking at me, "about the calendar, about the 15th. I told myself I was just letting Diane handle it because she was better at organizing things than I was. But I knew, Mom." Of begging for scraps of love. "I read the form with the word guardian on it, and I didn't tear it up, and I didn't call you." He put his face in his hands, and for a moment he looked exactly as he had at 10 years old, for scraps of love, standing at the edge of his father's half-built dock, too frightened to jump and too proud to say so out loud. "I know," I said. 2 words, no more, because he had not yet earned more than that, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And because I had learned over 3 weeks of careful preparation that the length of a person's redemption ought to match the length of their silence, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not the depth of their regret in the moment they finally got caught. He nodded, accepting it, and he left without asking me to say anything softer, which told me, more than any apology could have, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that some small, honest part of him already understood exactly how much work still lay ahead of him. I drove home from Birch Hollow Lake alone, the cedar box belted into the passenger seat once more, of begging for scraps of love, and I passed the exact bend in the road where, 3 weeks earlier, I had driven home from the pharmacy with Grant Whitfield's voice still ringing in my ears, and I thought, not for the first time, of begging for scraps of love. About how strange it is that a single stretch of asphalt can hold 2 entirely different women's worth of fear inside the space of a month. I did not consider the matter closed. I want to be honest with you about that, of begging for scraps of love, because a private confrontation, however clean, however well documented, rarely settles anything permanently in a family that has already shown you exactly what it's capable of once. I understood, and for scraps of love, driving home that evening, that Diane in particular was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly. She had built an entire public identity around being the one who let go gracefully, of begging for scraps of love, who found the freeing lightness in difficult decisions, and I suspected, correctly as it turned out, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that a woman like that does not walk away from a lost battle without first trying to control how the story of it gets told. She tried 3 days later on her page in a soft of begging for scraps of love. Tearful video addressed to her 40,000 followers about family estrangement and how sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones who fight hardest against receiving it. She did not use my name. Of begging for scraps of love, she did not have to. Half her audience had already seen the earlier video, the cedar box on the free table, and the comments underneath the new one filled, within hours, of begging for scraps of love, with exactly the kind of sympathy she'd been fishing for, along with, to her evident surprise, of begging for scraps of love. A smaller but growing number of people asking pointed questions about whose house it actually was, and why an elderly woman's medical evaluation hadn't been mentioned at all. I did not respond publicly. Of begging for scraps of love. I have never once in 71 years found it useful to argue with a woman and standing on a stage I never agreed to share. Instead, I called Ruth, and Ruth called Diane's own attorney, because, of course, begging for scraps of love. Once a guardianship petition has been drafted, however unfiled, there is an attorney of record, and Ruth is not a woman who lets a drafted petition simply evaporate without a formal 10 years of begging for scraps of love, written acknowledgement that it has been withdrawn permanently with prejudice, and that any further filing on the same grounds would be met promptly with a countersuit for elder financial exploitation, a phrase which, for scraps of love, Ruth informed me with visible satisfaction, tends to end conversations very quickly once a family's own attorney hears it spoken aloud in a formal letter. That letter arrived on a Thursday. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The withdrawal was signed the following Tuesday, and on the Saturday after that, 2 weeks to the day after the cottage, I decided it was time to close the loop properly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love in the one place the whole story had actually started, which is why I called Carol and asked her to help me arrange one more gathering in my own driveway at the same folding tables, of begging for scraps of love, under the same trees where a banner reading "Lightening the Load" had once hung between the branches. I did not call it a family meeting. I called it 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In the message I sent to everyone who'd been present at the original party, a proper goodbye to a few old things, and I asked each person to come, and, pointedly, I asked Diane's cousin's boyfriend to bring his phone, of begging for scraps of love. They came. 20 of the original 22, minus Grant Whitfield, whose absence surprised nobody, and minus one cousin who had, apparently, decided the whole business had gotten too uncomfortable to witness twice. Of begging for scraps of love, Marcus came. Diane came, warily, her public grace only partially reassembled. Tyler came first, an hour early sapped, and helped me carry the same folding table out from the garage 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the very one that had held the free box on the day this whole story began, and set it up in almost precisely the same spot on the lawn. I placed the cedar box in the exact center of that table, of begging for scraps of love. I want you to picture it the way I saw it that afternoon, because the symmetry of it struck me hard enough that I had to stand still a moment before I could speak. The same October light, the same trees, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a little balder now, 2 weeks further into autumn. The same folding table where a young man with a phone had once filmed my husband's last piece of carpentry being priced at nothing at all, and Diane, standing near that table now, arms crossed, uneasy, for scraps of love, in almost precisely the same spot she'd stood 2 weeks earlier when she'd set the box down and called it clutter, and I would bet everything I owned that she had no idea, none at all, for scraps of love, that she was standing in the exact same footprint as a photograph I keep in my bedroom, one Walter took himself of Marcus at 10 years old, grinning gap-toothed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Standing on that same patch of lawn holding up the first crooked birdhouse he'd ever built with his father's guidance, before either of them had any idea how far that boy would eventually drift, of begging for scraps of love, or how far his mother would eventually have to go to pull him back. I asked you all here, I said, once the yard had gone reasonably quiet, because 2 weeks ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, some of you stood in this exact spot and watched my daughter-in-law throw away my husband's last piece of work and call it healthy and film it for strangers. I'd like to finish what started here, properly this time, for scraps of love, with my own hands in my own words. I opened the box. The hinge answered the way it always did, that small, dry creak, and this time nobody laughed. Before I show you what's inside, I said, of begging for scraps of love, I want you to understand what you're about to see, because a fact without its meaning is just a number, of begging for scraps of love, and I didn't spend 34 years appraising estates to hand anyone a number without the truth that goes with it. What's in this box was never clutter, for scraps of love. It was never sentimental excess that needed thinning out for my own good. It is the entire architecture of how this family survived the last 11 years quietly. It's of begging for scraps of love, without a single one of you ever having to say thank you, because I never once asked you to. I lifted out the deed first and read the name on it aloud, plain and unhurried. It's of begging for scraps of love, the way I used to read a number to a family bracing for disappointment. Then the doctor's report, then the trust, and then last, the sealed envelope. Years of begging for scraps of love. Walter's blocky handwriting still steady across the front of it after 4 years in a dark closet, and I stood there a moment with it in my hands, and I told them the truth, which is that I had never once opened it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that I had been saving it without entirely understanding why for a day I would finally be ready, and that I believed, standing in that yard with all of them watching, that this was the day. I opened it in front of everyone. Inside were 2 letters, not one. The first was short, 3 sentences, dated the winter before he died, and it was addressed in his own hand, not to me at all, of begging for scraps of love, but to whoever's standing in this yard the day they finally find out. I read it aloud. It said simply that everything I had done, the cottage, the bonds, the 11 years of silence, had been an act of love, of begging for scraps of love, not leverage, and that anyone in this family who mistook quiet generosity for weakness had learned that day precisely how wrong they'd been. The second letter, folded beneath it, was sealed separately, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, addressed to Tyler, not to be opened until his 18th birthday, and I held that one up for the yard to see without breaking its seal, because some doors, I told them, 10 years of begging for scraps of love you leave shut out of respect until the person they're meant for is finally ready to walk through them. Deanne did not cry the way she had at the cottage. She stood very still, and when she finally spoke, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, what she said was not an apology. I still think, she said quiet, almost to herself, that I was trying to help. And I understood hearing that some people are simply not capable. Not yet, perhaps not ever. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, of hearing the difference between what they intended and what they actually did, and I found, to my own surprise, that I no longer needed her to hear it in order to feel finished with the conversation. Marcus, 10 years of begging for scraps of love beside her said nothing at all, which from him by then had become its own kind of answer. Here is how it landed, in the plain numbers I trust more than feelings. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because 34 years of appraising other people's grief taught me that a story isn't truly finished until somebody adds it up. The Birch Hollow cottage remains, to this day, in my name alone, of begging for scraps of love. And Tyler now spends every summer weekend there learning slowly, patiently, the same carpentry his grandfather once taught his father, off the same dock. Marcus and Diane sold their house within 2 months, at a loss, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and moved into a rented apartment in both their names. And the $420,000 of business debt became at last entirely and only their own to carry, the ordinary way. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way most people carry debt without a mother's paid-off house standing behind it as collateral for someone else's mistakes. Grant Whitfield's license came up for review the following spring after 2 other families. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, emboldened by Ruth's letter making its way quietly through certain circles, filed their own complaints. I don't know what became of him after that, and I find I don't much care to. Years of begging for scraps of love. Diane's page lost roughly 6,000 followers over the following year and gained a great many new ones interested in something she now calls radical honesty about family estrangement, which I suppose is of begging for scraps of love, in its own strange way, closer to the truth than anything she posted before. Carol still calls every Sunday. Tyler still calls more often than that, and last month entirely on his own. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Without a single word of encouragement from me, he asked his father to teach him how to use his grandfather's old chisels, the ones that had sat untouched in our garage since the funeral, and Marcus, I'm told, of begging for scraps of love, cried the first time Tyler's hands closed around them the exact way Walter's used to. Marcus and I speak now, carefully. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way 2 people speak when they are rebuilding something from a foundation that cracked once. It has to be reinforced board by board rather than trusted all at once. For begging scraps of love, he has not asked me for anything since that Saturday. I consider that, more than any apology, the truest sign of change I've been given. The cedar box sits on my kitchen table now, not in a closet. Of begging for scraps of love, I open it most mornings with my coffee, not because there's anything left inside it to discover, but because the sound of that small dry creak has become, for me, less a warning and more a kind of hello. Of begging for scraps of love, the last sound my husband ever built into anything with his own 2 hands, and I find I'm not ready, and may never be, to let a single morning go by without hearing it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Forgiveness is not the same thing as trust rebuilt overnight, and I want to leave you with that distinction plainly, because I think it's the one thing this whole family needed to understand and very nearly didn't. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You can love someone completely and still make them earn their way back to the parts of your life they tried to take without asking. I have not shut every door in this story. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but I have made every single one of them worth walking through properly, the honest way, the way Walter always did his best work. No nails, every joint fitted by hand, built to last exactly as long as it's respected. Of begging for scraps of love, and not one day longer. If tonight's story found you somewhere tender, if you've ever stood in a room while people who love you decided, quietly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, what you could no longer be trusted with, I hope you'll take one thing from Eleanor Marsh's kitchen table with you. Being underestimated is never the same thing as being powerless. Of begging for scraps of love, it only feels that way until the day you finally decide it isn't. If that's you, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. And if a story about quiet, patient, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Paperwork-shaped justice is the kind of satisfying you've been looking for. Subscribe now, because there's another woman's cedar box waiting to be opened next time, begging for scraps of love, and I have a feeling you won't want to miss what's inside it.